David just removed him. And we're going to start soon, but we're waiting on a couple chairs, so we'll silence everybody when we're ready to go. Thank you so much. Yeah. Just along here would be perfect. Okay, so do we have to go up now, or just as they present and sit down?
I think as they present, so they could watch the script.
Okay, everyone. We're going to go ahead and begin. We had a few logistical hiccups, but we're ready to roll. So, are we ready? Okay. So, thank you, everyone, for joining us today while we talk about Earth observations for disaster risk reduction. I am Shana McLean. I work for NASA's Applied Sciences Disasters Program, where I lead a lot of our programmatic efforts on risk reduction and resilience. And I'm joined by the co-facilitator today, Andrew Kruszkiewicz.
Thank you, Shana. I'm Andrew Kruszkiewicz. I'm a faculty lecturer at Columbia University in New York at International Research Institute for Climate and Society, also science advisor for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center.
Okay, so today we're discussing the role of data and Earth observations in risk reduction. But what we're really doing is trying to understand and manage risk by focusing on the foundational elements of the humanitarian issue. Risk is inherently human. We've got a lot of components about data that are looking at the hazard, but we're missing some of the issues related to vulnerability and exposure. We're also we're not getting to the complexities of the different inequalities that occur, the different locational changes that occur, and the dynamic processes and the way the questions change regarding risk over time. This means that today we're going to showcase the role that humanitarian actors have in these dynamic settings, where the challenge is not whether data exists, but whether we're talking to the people who need to make decisions on the ground, whether the types of data that they're being provided was done with them in mind and with collaboration in discussions with them in an iterative process. A lot of times they provide the context that we need to make our data important, usable, and applicable in community settings. This is also linked to the fact that across geo, we're trying to we're seeing an increase in the need for users to be integrated into our data development and model development processes. And so in order to do this, in order to really understand who the users are, the people that work on lives and livelihoods, we're inviting the humanitarian community to join us today and talk about their stories, their contexts, the way that they make decisions, with the hope that it can inform the way that we develop data products and models moving forward.
Thank you, Shana. This work. And humanitarians, just as a reminder, work in complex settings with people in different levels of vulnerability. This builds off prioritized themes of geo, urban, indigenous, islands and isolated communities, population movements. By grounding the discussion in the actions taken by the humanitarian community related to disaster risk reduction to be enhanced by elements of how the EO community can better integrate the considerations of the humanitarian community within the current and future goals and priorities. Humanitarian organizations and actors contribute to a collective understanding of risk, of the stories of the interaction between social and cultural, and the physical and built elements that we should be considering. And that requires data products that consider these fluctuations in order to strengthen decision-making. Humanitarian action is one of partnerships, built upon relationships with networks of actors working across sectors. We can learn from these partnerships and the community perspectives taken to better inform the development of our data and of our risk models. The humanitarian sector represents the interface between science and the environment. They can help translate and broker the elements on the ground to better inform science, which in turn informs more appropriate, timely, and quality-controlled humanitarian decisions. Of particular importance for understanding risk of impact from disasters is fragile contexts, in which rapidly changing disaster risk reduction-related questions yields rapidly changing questions and considerations and decisions. Finally, this session represents an invitation for all of you to participate in the Earth Observation for Humanitarian Action initiative. First, to determine the extent we can, as an Earth Observation community, integrate humanitarian questions and considerations into our actions, into our data development and dissemination processes. And second, to identify opportunities to build off existing initiatives within GEO by learning and expanding from the experiences within the humanitarian sector. Finally, the opportunities here to frame future GEO work around the questions that aren't answered yet, and some questions that have not been enabled because of the lack of connectivity between humanitarian considerations and the development and dissemination of satellite-derived and Earth observation data. We look forward to the discussions today that will continue beyond this event. And tomorrow, we invite you to attend a follow-up meeting in which Shana and I will facilitate further discussion and dialogue to lead towards the drafting of key bullet points and key themes to be captured moving forward. So I'll turn it back over to Shana for some logistics of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So we're going to invite each of the speakers up individually. They'll present on their work, and then we'll have that followed by a brief Q&A session where we look forward to the questions from all of you. So we'll start with Veronica Bell and Olivia Warwick. Please come up.
How do I move a slide? That one? That one?
Should be up.
Place it at that thing. There we go. Yes. Ta-da.
Is this the start?
That's it. Yep.
Okay, awesome.
That. Okay. I think I've just demonstrated how good I am with the technology around here. So my name is Veronica Bell, and I'm the head of International Technical Services with Australian Red Cross, and my colleague Olivia.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. I'm Olivia Warwick. I work with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre. I'm based in New Zealand. I'm the Senior Pacific Climate Advisor.
I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of what is the Red Cross. The Red Cross movement is the largest humanitarian organisation in the world. The movement is comprised of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescents, and the Federation is made up of 191 national societies in 191 countries. 160,000 branches globally, and 17 million volunteers worldwide. We like to say that we are a movement that is present before, during, and after disasters and crises. And we're embedded in the communities that we work in, but we also enjoy unique auxiliary status to the public authorities in the countries where we work. And we're recognized at national level and have mutually agreed upon roles and responsibilities with the governments in our countries that we're working based on national legislation and international humanitarian law. This presence from the household right up to national level really gives us unique status and affords us really privileged access to debates and discussions at every level. It also affords us opportunities for dialogue and partnerships with key decision makers at national, regional, and global levels. And we very much act as a broker, a facilitator, to convey community challenges to key influencers, and taking on a role of facilitating multi-stakeholder networks and partnerships to identify appropriate and sustainable solutions to the issues that vulnerable communities are facing. We are known for our role as first responders. First response is our core mandate, but we're also increasingly focusing on anticipatory action to mitigate the impact of disasters and crises on vulnerable populations. We're all aware that disasters and crises are increasing in number, in severity, in protraction. And we also recognize that we need to be acting earlier, so acting upon early warnings, taking early action. There's a lot of research that shows the impact of disasters and crises on communities could be mitigated, and importantly, the costs associated with response interventions reduced, both on lives and livelihoods, but also the economic costs. If greater investment was made in upfront reduction of risk and preparedness and strengthening of resilience. We still see today that most of the resources that are directed towards humanitarian efforts are still heavily weighted towards the response side of the spectrum. And we are working with partners such as many of you in the room, looking at how can we get better information and data to make better informed decisions earlier, so that with communities we can identify appropriate actions that can be taken earlier in the cycle rather than waiting for a disaster to hit and then responding. So we're talking about responding to forecasts and alerts and warnings as opposed to only responding to disasters. It doesn't mean that the disaster won't occur. It doesn't mean that a disaster response will not be needed. But if we can get more systematic effort into looking at anticipatory action, we believe that the impact of disasters and the cost of disasters can be reduced. We're grappling with a series of questions at both community level and at organizational level that we believe Earth observations have the potential to contribute to resolving if we're all working together. Communities want to know, what is this hazard going to do? What's going to happen in my community if this event occurs? And importantly, what can I do to reduce the risks? What is it worth doing? What are the actions that I could take that actually are going to have an effect? And how can I safeguard my livelihoods? how different are the risks that I'm facing now from those that are anticipated in the future? And how can I prepare? If we're looking at anticipatory action, it's grounded in really strong preparedness. How can communities best prepare? Where will we be safe from floods and storm surges in coming years, and a generation from now? So we all know that what we do now is not going to be sufficient as contexts evolve, as things move forward. What are the steps that we can take now that will position us better to be able to protect ourselves in the future? Humanitarian actors, some of the key questions that we're grappling with is who is most exposed and most vulnerable to the hazards that we're predicting, and where are they? And therefore, where and when should decision makers carry out early actions? So we need to be making informed decisions that are targeted at those who are most vulnerable. Where is investment most needed? In particular areas, where will safe evacuation spots be? As flood levels change, where will we need to be thinking about evacuation centres being positioned? And can we get a more dynamic, a more accurate picture of the dynamic nature of risks for people in place by integrating Earth observations with any of the following, such as live individual scale sensing information, crowdsourced observations, available living sensing data, available vulnerability and capacity information, and already existing forecast-based models. Lots of questions that we're grappling with. We certainly don't have all of the answers, but we recognise the need to be working with others to explore those. We have had some experience, and Olivia is going to talk about some of our work in Mongolia and the Pacific to highlight some of the work that we've been doing.
Great, thanks very much, Veronica. Ta-da! All right, so we're increasingly using Earth observations in the context of impact-based forecasting to move more towards this anticipatory approach that Veronica's very nicely outlined here. And I guess one of the approaches that we're increasingly engaging in within the Red Cross movement is forecast-based financing. So I'm going to very, very quickly outline an example of a forecast-based financing initiative from Mongolia. So key premise of forecast-based financing is let's decide what it's worth doing based on information well before the forecasted event is likely to happen. Let's find financing to support those early actions to occur rather than respond to disasters. So this example here is from Mongolia for Zood hazard. I do not work in Mongolia at all. I work in the Pacific, so this is a very unusual hazard for me to be talking about. But it's essentially a very cold period that is followed that follows extreme drought. And the main risk to communities during very severe Zood periods is loss of livestock. Okay, livestock is livelihood and everything to people. So basically what happens is vulnerable herders end up having insufficient access to animal feed and vet supplies during years of increased stress on animals due to Zood. And this can lead to large-scale mortality, which has many knock-on effects, as you might imagine, on household income, trauma, health impacts, that type of thing. The best time to give support to herders is well before the livestock start being impacted. So once it's been cold for a while and animals have been without feed for a while, it's basically too late to do much about it. That needs to happen well in advance. So within the forecast-based financing system in Mongolia, the early action to address that specific risk that was identified as most appropriate is basically vulnerable herders in areas with high zood risk are given an unconditional cash transfer when areas are identified as very high risk of livestock death. And this is where the Earth observations element comes in. So the trigger for releasing financing and doing actions is based on a zood risk map, which is not developed by the Red Cross. It's developed by the National Meteorological Agency in partnership with Nagoya University in Japan. And it's a collaboration between the Mongolian Red Cross, the National Disaster Authority, the Met Service, and the Japanese agency. So essentially, it uses a biomass anomaly, a vegetation density index, to see what the pasture growth has been in the summer months prior to the onset of potential zood. This acts as a proxy for basically how much the animals would have been able to fatten, which gives an indication of how robust those animals might be to see them through a particularly harsh winter. Okay, so this gives us our exposure. On top of that, there is a social vulnerability index layer, which looks at, I'm not too clear on the details of this, but I would assume it looks like at factors like household poverty, household assets, the type of livestock that households have. That gives us our vulnerability layer. Okay, so we're basically adding a vulnerability layer with an exposure layer that's given to us through Earth observations. That's then overlaid with a seasonal forecast for cold and snow to produce a level of risk of livestock death. Okay, and so the early actions are triggered basically when 20% or more, 20% of 3 or more provinces show red, which is the highest risk level. I hope I'm getting this right. Andrew probably knows far more about this than I do, given that he actually works directly on this project. So that gives you a bit of a sense of how an Earth observation-derived product, an impact-based forecast, can be used within a much broader context of anticipatory action to set off a chain of events that can help people to prepare, to save costs, to reduce suffering. Okay, so I'm going to move now from Mongolia to the Pacific, which is much closer to home for me. What I'd like to do is just share very quickly a few lessons that we have learned over the years from the climate services space. Okay, so in a slightly different capacity, I co-chair the Pacific Island Climate Services Panel. The IFRC has been involved in climate services in the Pacific for a number of years to provide that user, that intermediary organisation piece between communities and science providers. I think the key takeaway that I'd like to sort of put forward from this is that what we've learned over time is that data alone does not always lead to better decisions by users. Okay, it doesn't always lead to people doing things differently. And there's an assumption that if people can access data, and they can access data-derived products like a model, a forecast, a map, they will do things differently in a more risk-informed way. But that doesn't just happen, okay? That needs investment. It needs integrated programming. It needs partnerships. It needs multiple organizations that operate at every part of that disaster risk reduction ecosystem to come together and work together on programs that are funded across, okay? Some key questions that we want to ask when we're thinking about data and data-derived products is, did users ask for it? Okay, is this something that a group of people actually said, right, we need this data to solve this particular problem that impacts our lives? So for example, a seasonal rainfall outlook might give information over the coming 3 months about whether or not conditions are likely to be drier or wetter, but that alone isn't necessarily what communities are asking for. They're saying, how likely is it that there's going to be a problematic dry period or a drought, and what are the impacts of that going to be? What is normal rainfall? What is above normal rainfall? What is below normal rainfall? And what are the implications of that for my life? Okay, another really crucial question is, do users have a thorough and accurate understanding of what the data-derived product is telling them and what its limitations are? Okay, so what we can see here on screen, all of the words, which I'm certainly not going to read out because I was instructed very, very firmly to not include words on my slides. What we can see here is a very simple alert system that has quite a lot of science behind it. Okay, so this is a seasonal rainfall outlook product that is designed specifically for disaster managers working in the humanitarian sector that basically says, it's low alert, medium alert, or high alert for rainfall anomalous conditions over the coming 3 months. Okay, previously this information was being provided through very complicated climate bulletins that included information on probabilities, terciles, all of these words that, our Red Cross branch officers, for example, were not understanding, not really knowing what the meaning of that was or what to do with this information. So we developed a collaborative partnership between the Australian Bureau of Met, SPREP, the IFRC, and a range of national meteorological services to design this methodology of instead presenting this as very simple alert levels. This still contains the science. It's got probability, it's got skill scores behind those alert levels. But it's presented in a way that people can take action on. The other important part of this is that it has the links to actions. Okay, so the other crucial question that needs to be asked is, okay, people have the data, they have the data-derived products, they understand it, great. Do they know what to do about it? Do they know what it's worth doing? So we've done a lot of work to think about matching levels of alert of anomalous rainfall to actions that people in a very participatory and ground-truthed way are identifying as worth doing. Okay, so right through from very low regret actions to quite high regret actions that you wouldn't want to be doing unless you were pretty sure that the event was going to happen. All right, so I think I'm probably coming up pretty close to my time here. A couple of, closing points. So, in whose lap does this all fall? In the climate services space in the Pacific, national met and hydro agencies are saying, wow, that's a lot for us to take on. So now not only are we expected to, be producing the information, the data, the products, we're also being expected to communicate it to everyone from, the Red Cross to the NDMO to communities. We're also being expected to work with, these collaborative partnerships to enable early action. It doesn't necessarily sit within our mandate. What we've started to move towards in the Pacific is much more collaborative partnerships at both national and regional level. So a great example is the Solomon Islands Met Service. I was hoping that Director David Heber would be here, but I don't see him in the audience. Have developed an MOU with the Solomon Islands Red Cross, which basically is an agreement which gives them the function to be working with the Met Service to do a lot of the communication and the outreach of products and services, and to help the Met Service to get feedback from users as to whether or not this is actually meeting their needs. Do they understand it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I think I'm going to finish there because I'm probably close to my time. Yeah, over my time. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you both very much while we're figuring out our technical issues. So wonderful, excellent. We'll now have Andrew Lind come up and speak. Andrew.
Yeah. Hi, so I'm Andrew Lind. I'm the Senior Regional Emergency and Post-Crisis Specialist for IOM in Asia Pacific. Let's see if we can... Yeah. So for those of you who don't know IOM, it's an intergovernmental organization established in 1951, and it's now part of the UN since 2016. We have 400 offices, and because we have our own sort of charter from previously, we have our own member states, not necessarily the UN member states, right? So 173 member states. So, the overall focus of IOM is on migration, promoting safe and orderly migration, which really, for us, comes down to services and advice to both migrants and governments, and it spans both the humanitarian and the development side. I say that very quickly to say what IOM is. It's a pretty large organization, but my area of focus and what I'm going to talk about today is I focus primarily on migration crisis scenarios, which is under what we would call forced migration. Forced migration being any situation where people are moving not necessarily by choice in some sort of voluntary way. Specifically, what I deal with mostly is internal displacement, so people who are moving mostly from natural disasters and conflict within their own country, and of course we collaborate with UNHCR and others when it comes to refugees. These are just some of the major sectors that we work in, and I just, the main one that is important to know about from IOM is pretty much any place in the world where there is internal displacement with camps, collective centers, evacuation centers, something like that. IOM is one of the key agencies responding, particularly if it's a natural disaster, but also in conflict. And displacement is a normal phenomenon. For some reason, people don't necessarily like that word. We have another colleague who will talk about the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center we'll discuss, but displacement, at least from our side, is any time a person has to leave their house because of a conflict or a natural disaster or some other type of event that forces them to flee. So while there can be very good positive forms of displacement, like you go to an evacuation center, you get services, and you go home, that's displacement, but it's also in the context of being forced to be in a camp for up to 20 years or longer in some cases, right? So we deal with both, and our focus is to support governments and the migrants, the displaced people themselves, to make sure that it's a humane and dignified situation, and ideally they return or resettle or whatever happens. So from our side, we really look at like solutions, shelter, wash, all these areas. We do it all, but in the format of looking at human mobility. So why are people moving, and what kind of support do we need to help them on? So that's just a short introduction on that. From my side, just to understand my role in Asia Pacific and what I do for the organization, I have two major roles. One is to be the person who's in charge of major humanitarian responses. So I fly in and I take over in many cases. So if there's most recently, recently I went to Mozambique actually, outside my region for that. But I also go to Bangladesh. I've been to Nepal. And then in the Pacific, things like in Papua New Guinea or Fiji with Winston, coming into those smaller scale where the capacity needs are there. So I usually fly in and I take over large responses and set up the overall response. I also, in Asia in particular, we do a lot of disaster risk reduction dedicated programming along with linking it to other types. So disaster risk reduction for me is everything from making sure that we look at the ways in which mobility or movement of people actually can be a risk reducer, because it's not always mitigating displacement, but it's also enabling people to move in order to reduce risk, to get out of places that are unsafe. We also, of course, focus on mitigation, like community-based work, where we're trying to help, and also working with governments to enable that process. And as especially in this area on shelter, but any kind of construction or any kind of rebuilding, it's all about building back safer so we stop that type of event from happening or reduce the risk that people are going to be displaced in the future. What I also want to talk about briefly is DTM, and I don't bring up DTM, I guess, how do I want to say this? DTM is a tool that IOM has developed, and I have a particularly it's a really interesting role in IOM because as an operations manager for humanitarian crisis, I also have an entire, basically, information management of human mobility team that I always get to bring alongside. So I have the position of being the operations manager who also gets to tell people what information I want from people who have a lot of experience on data science in the field. And I bring this up because when we talk about EO and DRR and how it links to the different sectors, there's some things that we've learned from what we do. One is we have what we call a methodological framework. I'm not going to show all the products and maps we have, But what's really important is we have core areas of focus in terms of what we collect, mobility, which is really about locations of people and what kind of needs and gaps and the impact on them that we're seeing from the disaster. We look at the flow monitoring, so that's movements. We also do registration and sampling surveys on those populations once we have baselines. What this does for us is we bring to the table when we go into a crisis, it's not just that IOM does this for ourselves, which it's useful for ourselves, and that's how we developed it originally. But we sit down with all sectors, so food security, WASH, protection, everybody. We bring them to the table. We go through what kind of questions they want to have asked, and we make sure that that's involved in our process so that when the product comes out, it's something that they can actually use and they know which questions and they can take it all, because we then publish it all in raw data so that they can use it for whatever they want. So if it's the food security cluster, they're going to want questions on whether people are getting food and what are the effects on the livelihoods and other issues. Every sector is going to have its own questions and every scenario is different, so it varies a lot for us. The other part is we do this with governments a lot, so even the products completely vary. So Indonesia wants Microsoft BI interactive online maps with stuff that they can click and figure out exactly how it's going to be. Other countries want standalone static reports and reports that go down to different levels of gradation in terms of subnational. So we do a lot of work around this, but it's really a process-oriented approach, but we do these things regularly. So they happen like every 4 weeks so that you get another product and you can see the trends. So that's how we do it. The great thing about it, for me, with the EO community, is that this means we also have a whole bunch of people with visualization, AI capacity, and everything. So I have my entire group of basically translators for someone like me to engage with anyone who's giving us satellite imagery and combine the maps so that I know floodplains, movements, and everything we can put them together. So that's how we see it from the current perspective. But I want to talk about where we're kind of going and where we have done some things really interestingly in Bangladesh. And I don't bring Bangladesh because of the crisis part. I want to talk about the disaster risk reduction part of Bangladesh. So in order to frame it, I mean, this is just quickly the satellite images of, this is I was there until about February of 2018. So this just gives you kind of the speed of what was happening. This was all pre-Rohingya crisis. There was already about 200,000 people in the area, and then by December, it's just, it's a lot bigger than that even, right? The camps. But what's really interesting about this is we basically have an area with almost no information, where it was a forest area, so it was a forest reserve, so the government didn't have any urbanization plans, no topographical maps, no nothing, basically. No soil samples, no estimates of anything, and we even had to come up with ways to get our own understanding of the aquifers and figure out whether we were going to tap them all out, right? So, but what happens is a massive urbanization, basically. In a rapid 3-month period, we go from 0 to urban, because the density is worse than Dhaka, and if anyone's ever been in Dhaka, it's pretty bad. This is worse, right? So in that sense, one of the things that was happening was all the different humanitarians come in, and then they hire a bunch of service providers, and you have different people creating models for landslide and flood risk, cyclone risk, which is still not dealt with, but that's a tough one in this situation. You also have everyone downloading Windy and Wonderground and like looking at different apps and trying to make predictions about what's going to happen and how we have to solve problems, all within their little piece of the area, right? So we have the coordination sector, but it wasn't really coordinated around the disaster risk reduction and the emergency preparedness. So what happened was, very conveniently, some of the colleagues who are here moderating were interested in supporting, and they came in and they facilitated a process with all of us, the humanitarians. We brought everyone together to look at all the different models, all the different data, and to start coming up with a process where you're asking questions and deciding which information, which SOPs, which thresholds we actually need to know about, and which ones we don't really need to know about, because people get a little bit crazy, and if you've ever been to Bangladesh, it goes like this in terms of emergency every 3 hours. So we needed to have everyone sit down and take a little time with people who actually know how to do this to go through the data and understand where we're going to go. And one of the things I just let me see. One just example of this, and so this is something that IOM produces, which is fine from an impact after the fact situation. So this is just one day landslide incidents on the 14th of October in 2019. So that seems like really bad, I know, because there's a lot of incidents. But the reality is that what we had was we already had alerts in place for the type of monsoon rains that would cause us to be concerned that this kind of thing would happen. So we know it's going to happen because of the situation we're in, because we can't engineer ourselves out of everything in terms of problem. What we can do is when the alert comes out, already Red Cross, for instance, with all of its search and rescue teams, including local volunteers from the Rohingya population, who are already prepared and enabled with a flag alert, they know that this is now happening. WFP, IOM, and the military of Bangladesh, depending on what we're looking at, redeploying all of its equipment, because we might have it in some place doing construction of roads, and now we know that in 2 days, it may be that stuff is stuck there for a month if we don't get it out. So we just spread it out into different places so we can enable ourselves to work back the access and be back to a stable position. And of course, having supplies positioned, knowing which places are at risk so that you have everything ready so you can save lives. And this has been really important. So you have a lot of these risks, but you don't have a lot of lives lost from landslides in these situations. Occasionally something happens, but in most cases, there is support and it's happening very quickly because it's already anticipated. And so that's been sort of our learning on that process, is how important this sort of iterative process is for us, that we are engaging with the different actors. So you have EO type knowledge about meteorological information. You have other people bringing in whatever they've done on landslide models and soil sampling, and engineers looking at all, but they're all sitting together and coming up with what the process is and what information we need to know at different times to develop product to reduce the risks. Okay, oops. So this, just to summarize a few thoughts from my side, problems we encounter within our work with the EO community, but can also be different types of actors within information management as well that come in from outside. But you get issues about gaps in specificity. Reliability is a big problem. Like I said, everyone downloads their own apps and just has their own version of what is important. And the usefulness of the data, which is about having someone ask the questions and bringing it back. I know also from our work with DTM, and I'm sure it's similar in other places, although we're getting better at understanding data that comes in, there's big gaps in terms of different organizations and different people in organizations to really understand what they're receiving. So a lot of times we spend quite a bit of time just on our data, which to me is very simple, Excel sheets, maps, explaining what these maps mean in terms of displacement, where people are, what their gaps are, and how to use it as a tool for operational decision making, which is not always easy for people. And they also get a lot of information, so you have to force them to sit down and look at it. As I said, it's really iterative, this process. In the humanitarian, when I say that, I mean like major crisis. It's like a rapid cycle of iteration, so you have to have people physically there, or at least having calls all the time to be getting stuff. When you look at longer-term DRR, there's more chance for regular meetings, but not having it always like in a 24-hour period. But in general, you give some information, the information is going to have more questions. And then someone's going to go out to the field to try to apply it, and they have more questions. So we have this cyclical way of doing things. And that's why we kind of want to promote this model that we have in a case like Bangladesh, and I think we can do it in a lot of other places, is really having partnership where we have sustained relationships with the EO community, with the humanitarians, with the different capacities that everyone brings to the table, so that we put it together and we really learn, and that will improve the user side of things, but also improve the science side of things, because then you'll know what other things you can be looking for that you may not have thought of before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So we've heard from two different elements of the humanitarian focus on risk reduction. So now, because a lot of us are interested in the data elements, we're going to start moving towards how we can connect some of what we've heard about the partnerships, the different changing decisions that need to be made, and what the different roles from the Earth observation community can play. So we'll first have Justin Jannett come up, then David Green. Justin.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justin Jannett. I'm the head of data and analysis at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center based in Geneva, Switzerland. Thanks to my fellow panelists and the organizers and to all of you for having us here. It's a very exciting opportunity for us. I'm going to pick up on a couple of themes that Olivia particularly and Andrew mentioned and come back to them. But first, just a couple of very brief words about the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, and who we are. We were established 21 years ago at the request of the international humanitarian community to collect information and monitor and report on situations of internal displacement all around the world. This is displacement caused by armed conflict and violence, disasters, impacts of climate change, as well as large-scale development projects. And as we began working on the issue of and monitoring situations of disaster displacement, we, back about 10 years ago, we quickly learned that the discourse around disaster displacement was a bit less oriented around what was happening in the past or what had happened in the past and the risk of what may happen in the future. So how do you, this is during the implementation of the Hyogo Framework for Action, and now this has been brought on into the Sendai Framework for Action on disaster risk reduction. So why displacement? You've heard from Andrew from IOM, and now you're hearing from me on displacement. It's because within the context of disasters and disaster risk reduction, it's a significant issue. What you just see here is a couple of very brief snapshots. One is the amount of new disaster displacements we've recorded over time by year, the number of events represented by the darker blue line. And then here on the right behind me, you see the different hazards that are responsible for these displacements. And I think the main takeaway from the part on the right is that most of the displacement, as you see, are caused by hydrometeorological hazards, which actually for this community represents a big opportunity, which I'm going to come to in just a couple of minutes. Oops. Ta-da, I'm done. Well, while we're waiting for the IT to come back, most of the information that we collect and report on when we report back to the member states is captured in our global report. I've got some executive summaries up at the front of the room if you're interested, and this is what it looks like. Okay, so what you're seeing behind me here is our map, our live feed from the beginning of the year till yesterday on incidents of disaster displacement that we've captured. And the point of showing you this is really to underscore so we've seen that from the previous slide, it's a big issue. 24 million people on average displaced by every year. And here this map is showing you that it's happening everywhere. It's happening in small island developing states, it's happening in Australia, it's happening in Japan, it's happening in the United States, it's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. This is an issue that affects countries rich, poor, large, small, and everything in between. So it's a fairly universal issue, and it touches on everything from, as I mentioned, the Sendai Framework to the SDGs, as well as the New Urban Agenda. This is about really not leaving anyone behind, including the most vulnerable, and particularly the most vulnerable. Now, let's get to disaster risk reduction and further extensions of it. So as Olivia mentioned, there are a number of different components of a disaster risk. One is the hazard, the other is exposure, and then the third term of a risk model is usually the vulnerability parameter. For disaster displacement risk, we've adopted global disaster risk models and tweaked them to calculate the risk of displacement. And this is what it looks like. These are the results, normalized by population size. You can see where the risk is, where it's concentrated, and you have an understanding of what's behind it. So we know something about this, but there's a lot more that can be done. And the entire rest of my presentation, which is I think just 2 more slides, is going to unpack what can be done potentially through more collaboration between the geo community and those of us working on DRR and response and preparedness and response. So let me just back up a little bit. So normally, sorry for doing this. Normally, we have a probabilistic hazard model that we then generate probabilistic risk metrics from. But what if we actually replaced a probabilistic synthetic hazard scenarios with actual forecast hazard information or observational hazard information? What can we do with that? So, in other words, what if we took a cyclone track and wind speed data and storm surge information and plugged that into our model? What we can do is we can generate something like this, and I'm just going to unpack this for the rest of my time, to generate information that's in demand and of high value for many users. This is going back to one of the points that Olivia made, which is, do those problem owners have the information and the evidence that they need to take decisions and to take action? And do they know how to ingest it and to use it? And it's not always the case that is true. But one area where it's particularly salient is when we can transform simple hazard information into impact, because that's an attention grabber. That focuses their attention. Increased probability of rainfall of X millimeters means one thing. Increased likelihood of 50,000 people being displaced in the next 72 hours means something different, and it means you need to mobilize and prepare your evacuation centers in order to accommodate that inflow of people. So there are three separate entry points here that I just want to highlight for the geo community, where I think that there's some significant potential for what I would consider to be a high impact collaboration. So the first is simply the one that I mentioned earlier. Hopefully, this is the pointer, yes. Okay, so rather than using synthetic hazard scenarios, let's connect our hazard impact model to real-time and forecast hazard information. What we can then do with that, or what could be done with that, it's not just IDMC who can do this, it's obviously many, is to then generate modeled impacts. And this goes back to something that Olivia mentioned, which is if you're having a forecast-based financing mechanism, you need triggers for payouts to release the funds. Well, having impact-based triggers is a pretty powerful tool in the toolbox. What can then be done with that are the mandated agencies can then use this information, ingest it into their early warning systems, and disseminate life-saving information to populations at risk. As Andrew mentioned just a moment ago, not all displacement is bad. If displacement is taking place in the context of a preemptive mass evacuation that's saving lives, that's a good thing. So the massive displacements that we witnessed earlier this year in India and Bangladesh in the context of Cyclone Fani, that was our biggest disaster displacement event of the year so far, but it was actually it's not entirely a bad story, because tens if not hundreds of thousands of people who may have died and who probably would have died had that event happened in the 1970s or even the 90s, they were only displaced, so to speak, and only displaced for a relatively short period of time compared to, say, those who were displaced in Mozambique after Cyclone Idai, many more of whom still remain displaced because of the lower capacity within Mozambique. Anyway, so the first entry point, again, is to work with us to bring your data into our risk modeling, our hazard impact modeling and risk modeling, to strengthen it and to make it more user-oriented and operational. Second entry point, Earth observation data can be used then as part of the validation process. So my teams, I've got 10 people back in Geneva who are looking at displacement from a bunch of different sources. And what we need to do is then validate that before anything gets published. And one entry point here is that, some of the reported displacement can be validated or triangulated at the minimum with Earth observation data, with satellite imagery and other remote sensing data that's been analyzed. And then the third entry point is actually feeding back in. So as Andrew just mentioned, once people become displaced, that isn't the end of the story. What that just means is that you have new conditions of exposure and vulnerability. Right? If you've got people who've been displaced by a conflict or by a disaster and are now living in tents, they're much more likely to be more vulnerable than they were prior to having been displaced. So how do we then take account of that and update our risk models to account for the fact that you have a different configuration of population exposure and population vulnerability? Those are some signals for high priority disaster risk reduction interventions in order to get people either out of harm's way or to reduce their vulnerability, say, before the next monsoon season or before the next cyclone season occurs in a given area. So those are just three opportunities that I see through that, from which we can derive collectively a benefit by working more closely together. So I really appreciate your time and attention, and it's just been a privilege to be here with you, so thanks.
Thank you very much, Justin. So now we're welcoming David Green up to the stage. Everyone listen closely because he's had some vocal issues.
Okay, so I got laryngitis on the way here, so a little voice challenge, so I'll try and go through this quickly. I think what we wanted to do today was really humanize the geo, to really not just talk about users, but really bridge the gap between gathering the Earth data and really bringing it to communities where there's impact. But what I hope you saw with Olivia, Andrew, and Justin is that this is a mature and sophisticated humanitarian sector, familiar with data, able to use that data, and an awareness, as you said, is this is definitely a community activity. Unlike using those words arbitrarily, it takes all these elements, and the tools and capabilities are there to make it happen. Let's see. The other one. The other one. Okay, let's try. No, there. All right, so changing conditions on the planet, as we look at it as an entire system of the environment, the population, the built, the biophysical, the biogeological, the chemical, is changing all the time. And the nature of Earth observations, whether they're from space or on the ground, in the ocean, in the air, are monitoring those at all the times. We know from working with these partners that there are triggers, there are indicators that indicate when risk is accumulating. And by putting our information together smartly, we can actually reduce the risks. We can understand the implications. We can't necessarily stop the situations, but we can take actions to try and prevent them. In this case, I'm representing the community of Earth observation satellites that a few years ago recognized that it's not good enough just to respond when a disaster happens, but looking before and looking after. A few years ago, 2016, there was a collective effort to look at Haiti. An earthquake that happened in 2010 combined with economic disruptions, cultural changes, and various others that destabilized the country. An experience from looking at other parts of the world. Recognize that there are economic factors, there are human factors, there are displacement factors. But by responding to those and putting that information together, what was established is a recovery observatory to try and recover to a state of sustainable, operational, survivable practices. And so what happened is observations were certainly looked at all the time, monitoring the state of those changes, but now concentrating those observations specifically in a recovery phase. But as we said before, it's not just recovery, it's also understanding the responses and engaging with people. Here in this recovery observatory, it was bringing observations together to inform where was damage, where was impact, but also where was it safe, where was it possible to be rebuilt, where was it positive to make progress, and to engage with planners and city officials, health officials, food security, all the things you've heard from the previous discussion. GEO and CIOS enable data access, models, and decision making. One of the discussions that we had over the last few days is someone in the leadership of GEO said to me, I keep hearing only about data, but really do need to talk about the models and the tools. because that's where it becomes useful and practical. The humanitarian sector is really a translator, one that you can show, that brings that information to bear, along with a variety of other partners, to make those practices useful. Having the information in advance, whether it's for the ZUDs or for the floods, or for those examples here of knowing that there are areas susceptible to such things as landslides and those cascading impacts on transportation, on the isolation of communities. So the CIOS agencies and organizations have been doing pilots and demonstrators. Can we bring the information together? Can we show the value? Do we have the partners and those translators, such as the humanitarian sector, the Red Cross movement, and others? When these pilots and demonstrators were first set up, many of them didn't recognize that we had a gap in our GEO and CIOS community of these translators. These are now being built more functionally into recovery observatories and into preparedness and resilience activities. This year, 2019, was the second issue of the Global Assessment of Risk. And while in 2015, when it first came out, it talked about disaster risk, this year it articulated risk in a much more broader and holistic way. And it said working across sectors, multi-dimensions, multi-scales. What's shown here is a risk assessment framework which says that risk goes from global to local and back. It goes from humanitarian to political to policy and infrastructure. And it's not just the hazard. It is that vulnerability and exposure. All these elements. How can we, and I mean we here, everyone here and everyone at this meeting, we represent communities, we represent governments, agencies, and organizations that collectively can look at risk. That information casts down from looking at the global scale to local scale, whether the hazards are fires or whether the drivers are complex political destabilizations. We can work and bring that information down to community levels, to working with humanitarian sectors, with media, and with others to translate that information into effective actions. CIOS is committed to supporting these efforts, along with many other partners within GEO, looking at these frameworks, looking not just at a disaster event, but risk reduction looks throughout the entire, and in particular, looking in preparedness and in smarter recovery. Humanitarian assistance and disaster relief fit within all of these sectors. Disaster risk reduction is just one component. I'm from NASA and our disasters program. We're part of the applied science program. It's a very clever accumulation of people looking at water, capacity building, ecosystems. We are all tied together by risk. I look at one particular aspect of that, of disaster risk. But like much of the partnerships and community here, we have a very positive message. The right partnerships are making a difference. We can reduce multi-hazard impacts. We can bring exposure and vulnerability together. We can move towards sustainable goals, measurable objectives, urban sustainability. And like many of these frameworks have had, it said, look to science and technology for solutions. And we're starting to do that. One of the goals here in this session was to really expose the opportunity of bringing the humanitarian maturity aligned with its science and technology maturity, and to take that forward into our GEO family. And that's where I'd like to leave it here. Thanks.
Thank you, David. So I'd like to invite the panelists to take a seat up front, please, and we have time for some questions and answers. Just as a quick summary, though, while the panelists are taking a seat, David as well, just a reflection on some key themes that have emerged from the presentations. The idea of opportunities, the idea of people, the idea of how do we unlock the experience within the humanitarian community to be brokers and translators of action, of culture, of societal elements, so that humanitarian practice could influence the development of science, data science, climate science, to improve the way that humanitarian action, in particular early action in response to risk-informed activities, could take place. So I just think that as a general overview, that's been coming out of the discussion so far. And look forward to continuing that into the question and answer segment for the next 10 to 15 minutes. So do we have any questions? And we'll have Adrienne here moving around the room to capture some thoughts from the audience or some reflections. Now is the time, and we open it up to the group.
Thank you very much. It was fantastic. I'm Lawrence Friedel with NASA. I have a question picking up on the resilience, and I guess I'm wondering, is resilience something to maximize or to optimize? And I guess I'm wondering, are there examples of value frameworks from the humanitarian sector or other sorts of things? Are there value frameworks that could be used to help communities, based on their own values, decide on where they want to prioritize investments?
I'm trying to understand when we talk maximize and optimization this situation. I guess from my side, I mean, resilience is so multifaceted, realistically. It's a nice word that we can put a huge amount of stuff in. I mean, because realistically, I also end up dealing with conflict in other areas, right? I mean, I think at the community level, I think sometimes we divide our things into different silos, even within the humanitarian sphere and the different types of work we do. I mean, all of us who do community-based disaster risk reduction and resilience building, I think anyone who's been a part of that knows that it's really like risk and vulnerability mapping at the community level and helping them come up with their own plan on what they think and providing some guidance on how to go through that criteria and decision making. But ownership on their side is the key piece of it, truthfully, right, from our side, because we don't want to do it and impose a solution. We want to support them to decide. I mean, obviously, like I was saying, from the IOM perspective, we also try to make sure that people also think about movement and whether that's okay and not necessarily bad, because there's a lot of thought that, like, migration needs to be prevented or mitigated against because people move because of climate change or something like that, and that's a bad thing. But realistically, there's also just adaptation elements that need to be there. So we see it in that way at the community level. I think when you get to the government level, I get more, it's a little bit a bigger spectrum of things for me to think about in terms of what they have to invest in. It depends on each government, so it changes so much. But I think at the moment, yeah, we optimize, right, as much as we can, because there's just not enough bandwidth to handle everything in most cases. Like, even we were sitting with the Pacific earlier today, and like the amount of different things that realistically the Pacific has to deal with, and so it's really about helping them. They decide, and then we try to focus on that and get to a certain level where we can hand it over. That's my take on that.
I needed some time to digest that one. I think I want to pick up on at least one or two things that Andrew mentioned. One is that the decision and then the choice and the choice of the framing even, I think, really does depend on the problem owner in terms of whether whether you want to look at it the one way or the other. So, and I think often we're not IDMC isn't the problem owner. We are an evidence provider. We can help develop evidence and tools to be part of the solution, but we can't be the solution. It's not because it's not for us to decide. But what we could do, and this is something that Andrew mentioned during his presentation, is what we can make visible, we being all of us, this isn't just IDMC, but we can make visible the trade-offs among the risks, right? So there's, when you think of a disaster, we've talked, given the composition of this panel, you've heard quite a bit about displacement and displacement risk, but there are many other risks in a disaster, and those are, David had alluded to them in the new graph. You've got your economic loss risks, you've got your mortality risks, you've got many other things. But one goal maybe is to make those risks more manifest and transparent to allow the actual problem owners to weigh those trade-offs in a more evidence-based, transparent, robust manner.
I mean, I think if we're talking about frameworks, that the Red Cross is, we've got frameworks for everything, so do we have them? Absolutely. But I completely agree with Andrew. It's I think we play very much the role of facilitating the dialogue amongst the people who need to be making their own decisions. And I think one of the key things that we sometimes grapple with is knowing what it's appropriate for a Red Cross to be engaged in and what we need to work with others to be supporting communities to resolve. There can sometimes be a desire to try and help solve everything, and that's completely inappropriate. I think we have a very clear role, and we need to play that effectively and cleverly and work collectively with other people.
Thanks for those reflections, and I think Veronica's touching on a very important piece of the discussion about what is our responsibility as data providers. What is our responsibility in describing the constraints and also recognizing our privilege as being people that are able to access these large data sets and able to interpret them in certain ways. So thanks for the responses to the question. Would we like to take another question from the audience? I saw some hands up before.
Good afternoon. I'm Rob Deakin, the Geo Principal for New Zealand. Andrew touched on a few of the problems in the final slide that you summarized, but I just wondered if there are sort of common pain points that come through again in terms of getting hold of the right information rather than just data overload. It's all around getting those, I guess, elements of essential information that you need to make decisions. Are there any common themes that pop up in trying to get hold of the right information at the right time for the right people?
Thank you. Would you like to start at the David side of the panel? Or pass it to Olivia?
Thanks for the question. Just picking up on your last point, there's plenty of data, recognition of it being at the right time to really answer the right question. And I think we're progressing towards that. But where there's been sort of a gap or that missing piece is what we're trying to represent here is there's been, if you talk about the communications game, there's been sort of a break in the flow of the information. So there's a lot of people from the science, from the data collection, satellite grounds and weather, they're providing data. There's many in the science and development community creating products, creating services. But that link to the users, there's a lot of information and data that just falls on the floor. And so the gap, in a sense, is to be informed in that constant dialogue. One of the things you heard here, I hope you heard here, was a recognition for the value of the engagement that's really required, and that the humanitarian sector is helping fill in the gap of what data is actually useful and how to couple it with the culture and the context. So one of the things that's been missing is we have a lot of the physical data. We have a lot of the physical information. We have a lot of assumptions about where it's applied. We have a lot of training that goes on. But the data to put it in the cultural context, in the sustainable context, that's kind of missing. And it's also missing because we haven't respected the time it takes to have that trusted engagement. And that's what we're trying to say is a piece of geo which we think we're starting to strengthen.
Thanks very much. I really agree with those comments, particularly the comment around trust and the time that it takes to really build that sustainable engagement. I think a common theme that particularly that we see in the Pacific, and this came up in the Pacific Focus panel this morning, is that there is still, I have to say, a tendency for data-derived products to be still fairly supply-driven. And I mean that's a symptom, I guess, of a deeper kind of structural issues with the way that that aid and support is provided in the Pacific, but elsewhere as well. You know, we do see a lot of fragmented projects. We do see national governments having their absorptive capacity being completely overwhelmed by multiple stuff that's coming in, and it's always tempting, and there's always a tendency to say, right, let's try and develop the best data product that we can, but is there capacity within the national mandated authorities to actually sustain that over the long term? And is there the capacity there to actually get that uptaken and used for the intent that it's intended for? And like David said, that takes a long time and a lot of capacity building and a lot of regular engagement, and that's often not accounted for in project funding cycles. That requires a long-term programmatic approach, and we're not quite there yet in many respects.
I guess, yeah, it's an interesting question for me, is that for sure the engagement question is there. I mean, it's the same even for us. Like, a disaster happens. If we don't already have a relationship with the government, then we can't really work. And truthfully, it's not us. I mean, it's great to have partnerships with us, but also the real service, the support needs to go to the governments as the primary service point and the responsible actors for the disaster and management, right? So I think developing those relationships ahead of time is really the main thing. Like for instance, I mean, IOM and IDMC work a lot together. So if Justin were to contact me in the middle of a crisis, I would respond to him. Someone else that I don't know, I have 500 emails, so I'm not going to respond, truthfully, right? I mean, I have all the other things internal and everything else. So in order for me to make sure that I'm going to target the ones that I know, and I think it's the same for whether it's a meteorological agency or whatever it is, right? So those relationships ahead of time. I mean, but I do think there is still, there's data, but then the granularity that's needed for operational actors is not always at the granular level. Or it might exist, but that's not what the product is, right? So at least from my experience, what happens is, so for instance, with IOM, I'll give my experience on providing data in that sense with displacement, is you might have a nice trend analysis, and I'm an operational person, so that's nice. And I think that's cool for publicizing and putting on Twitter or something. But when it comes to what I actually need and what my own team needs, so I have the operations and I have my information management people, they need each location, what specific village, exactly what the water needs or the food security or whatever the specific things are. So the level of granularity and how to make that accessible so that someone can search, find what they need on that is something that we work on a lot. And we create reports that are designed by that are established with the community, but we also have other ways that we're trying to figure that out. But I think that's the hard part, because there's just a lot of people don't necessarily have the technical knowledge to find it in a full raw data set. So it's how do we create products that are granular and applicable to what they need in that. So it's not that the data doesn't exist, but how it's formatted, I think, is actually the bigger problem in a lot of cases.
Since I agree with everything that's just been said, I'll be extremely brief then. We look at it this way. I mean, if you want to get the action, you need to have the knowledge and the evidence and the knowledge of what to do, the capacity to take the action, and then the political will to take the action. And sometimes, and I guess going back to my other point, our starting point is we don't know. So next week I'm going to Fiji to spend time with 5 governments in the Pacific with colleagues from IOM to just listen to them and find out what are for the decision makers, because none of us are the decision makers, but to listen to the decision makers and find out what are their data and evidence needs, because that's our space. We're part of that, part of the solution. But before we design anything, before we produce anything, we're just going to listen to them and find out what are they currently using, because they all have something. They're not, no one's flying blind. And then what can we do to strengthen what's there already? Is it a matter of providing more evidence in a different way, or building their capacity to ingest and act on the evidence? But until we listen to them, it's going to be hard to know that.
Thanks very much, panelists. I think we're going to move on to the final segment of the session. So I ask the panelists to take a seat. Thank you very much. And very interesting reflections on building off frameworks to move past data and data representation that just looks nice to data and data representations that can be useful to influence decisions that impact people's lives. So thank you for the reflections on that. For the final segment of the session, I would like to first invite Ivan Deloach, Executive Director of the Federal Geographic Data Committee, to add some thoughts on key points of the session, then also some opportunities moving forward. Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you, Andrew. And before I get started, I want to thank the panelists for your very compelling and fascinating presentations. It just kind of amplifies and highlights the importance of the human factor in this whole process. And there's three things that I observed that I think was pretty consistent with all the presentations, and that's user requirements and understanding the user needs in terms of information, not just data, but information. The importance of data integration. While we're primarily focused here on Earth observations as well as in situ data, which is very important, it's really integrating that information with other data to tell the complete story, and more importantly, to provide the information for the decision maker. I mean, that's the critical aspect of that. And then lastly, partnerships. You know, we're all working in this together at various levels, but building that trust with various stakeholders, but also having the ability to work with folks across many domains. It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, I do that for a living every day, and it's a struggle coordinating across all the agencies, but more importantly, I think once you see the results of that work, and you're able to then communicate the value proposition for why you need to do it. And this is really critical when you start looking at disaster risk reduction, which, as we've heard today, has a lot of different components to it, and it's very complex, and it's not easy. But we are making inroads, and having the appropriate data at the appropriate time, I think, is very helpful and useful. I also serve as the U.S. representative on the program board for GEO, and we have the oversight responsibility for the work program. So we get to see a lot of these stovepipes activities coming in, and one of the things that we are very adamant about doing is encouraging folks to work across those various activities in the work program, which is very important. And as we know, Earth observations for humanitarian action is one of those initiatives now that's included in the program that we're expecting to be adopted at plenary this week. And it's just critical to encourage folks to work together, and I think that's very important. And then lastly, I just wanted to, again, thank the speakers for their presentations, and then I have a shameless plug for all of you. One of the things that we're doing in the United States, well, really globally, is working with the Open Geospatial Consortium on an initiative that we're calling Disaster Resiliency Pilots Program. And we started this a couple of years ago, and we've been trying to tackle some of these very specific issues that we heard about today, and NASA is one of those, as well as the Red Cross in the U.S. has been working with us in those, on that initiative, and we've really had some pretty good results this year. And for those of you who have interest in that, we will be showcasing that in the U.S. exhibit here for GEO. But more importantly, we want to encourage your participation for those who have interest. I think it's has been very fruitful. Sort of a minimal lift, but it really provides, I think, a great opportunity for us to kind of deal with the planning process and the preparedness process early on, so that we do have to respond and we do have to recover, we're in a much better position. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ivan. So just the last speaker that we're going to have come up is to connect what each of our speakers have said, along with the summary provided by Ivan, to talk about what this means to the GEO community, to all of you, and kind of what the feedback mechanisms, what the opportunities are to cut across. So James Norris from the GeoSec, please enlighten us.
So thank you very much. Conscious that we're already over time, I will keep my closing remarks as short as I possibly can, but please bear with me. One of the things, as I'm sure you're all aware, being this is a GEO conference, is that we are in the process of adopting and ratifying our new work program for the next year. My role within GEO Secretariat is to look after the Sendai Framework engagement priority area, making sure that our members, participating organisations, and the wider disaster risk community is aware of the benefits that Earth observations can have. So as this work program has developed, we've had a series of new activities that have come in focusing on Earth observations for Sendai monitoring. So actually, what can Earth observations do specifically against the targets and indicators of Sendai Framework? So really good for governments. Then we have activities such as Geodesy for Sendai. So again, really focusing on the specifics of actually what does the GNSS network, how can it help? Then we have an activity, EO for disaster risk management, which is a broader activity that covered some of the CIOS activities David was talking about, looking at some of the disaster pilots, looking at some of the flooding pilots, and looking at some of the landslides to work out how they can be, the information can be used for risk reduction. But one of the things that is lacking, and I'm well aware that it's lacking, is actually how does the humanitarian community fit into the GEO work program? So for that, I'm really pleased that Shana and Andrew and others and the panelists here have joined us in this forum to raise this as a real key issue. So one of the things I'm looking forward to, and especially with the 8 a.m. meeting tomorrow, is to actually work with you to discuss with you what can we as a GEO community, what can I do as a member of the GEO Secretariat looking at disaster risk reduction, what can we do to make sure the users of Earth observation data, whether it's the organizations we have here or the ones that are missing. So I really do encourage you to stay involved in this process, and if you've got issues, questions, concerns, or any way that you would like us to help you, then please do come through me. And this does come together with something that another shameless plug like Ivan had. Across the entire GEO community, we are setting up a disaster risk reduction working group. The working group is designed to encompass all of the GEO activities in the work program. So there are about 20 activities in the work program which are focused one way or another on disaster risk reduction. That's a lot of people, that's a lot of activity. But there's a lot of organizations who aren't involved in the work program. There's a lot of organizations who don't know who GEO are, don't know what GEO does, don't know how Earth observations can help them. So for me, setting up of this disaster risk reduction working group is a mechanism for us as a community, as experts, to come together and really promote the use of Earth observations for risk reduction. So if you're still here on Wednesday at 3:30, we do have a meeting which follows the GEO plenary session. If you're not here but would still like to be involved, come and collar me and I can add you to our mailing lists when they do it. But I think that's all I'm going to summarize and say thank you very much. And I really do hope we get this as an ongoing activity and can have a two-way relationship where GEO does help your humanitarian communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you all for joining us today for this session. What we're going to do, Andrew and I will be holding a meeting tomorrow morning to essentially touch on the points that James just mentioned. How can we start integrating humanitarian considerations into existing GEO activities, and then also understand what may be additional questions that are unanswered, what they might look like in a new community activity under Earth Observations for Humanitarian Action. So anyone who's interested in joining this discussion and being a part of this conversation, please join us tomorrow morning at Brew and Brew, which is just a block away from this building. So thank you again. Thank you to the panelists. Have a wonderful afternoon.